Hello, everybody. Welcome to Third Tuesday Conversation. My name is Danica Olson, and I will be your host. I hope you had a great summer. It's sort of strange to jump back into fall. Having a hard time transitioning my world, it feels like. But we're glad to be together once again. Thanks for tuning in. We have Andrew Root with us today, who is a professor, writer, and researcher. Hi, Andy.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you doing, Danica?
Good, thank you. Hey, just if you're joining us for the first time, I want to let you know that this is an interactive conversation. So if you have a question for Andy as we go along, type your question in the uh, box that says question on the right-hand side of your screen, and we'll pass them along as we go. So we have invited Andy here to talk about his latest project called Science for Youth Ministry. And so wondering if you could tell us about this project. What are you doing with it? Well, let's start there. What are you doing with this
Yeah.
awesome project?
Yeah. Well, in some ways the project has been kind of important to me. I mean, I don't think that in my previous work there's been like a strong leaning towards the natural sciences or anything like that. But I mean, I've been interested for many years on just thinking about how our lived experience and through our lived experience we encounter the presence of God um, and so you have to look at, when it's taking a class from me, we have to often look at like the social sciences and help interpret those experiences, but the natural sciences are really interesting to try to interpret our experience as well and experiences of our world. And so this grant in some ways just fell into my lap. There's a guy by the name of David Wood who's been very involved in the Templeton Foundation. He's a pastor outside of Chicago, and the Templeton Foundation had done a bunch of things for congregations. I mean, Templeton usually does like really high order academic funding, like they want to fund the person at Harvard or Yale or Princeton who's going to write the book that the rest of the professors will read and then teach, but they've started to want to kind of impact more public engagement and get stuff more on the ground. And so David was really essential in that, and they did grants called Scientists and Congregations, where actual scientists who worship in churches were talking about how they held their faith and their vocation together and things like that. So David had this idea that, man, the youth ministry world is so well networked, particularly the Protestant youth ministry world is so well networked, and we know from certain sociological studies that just battles with certain scientific perspectives, and we could kind of get technical scientific epistemologies of how we know things has been a struggle for young people as they try to hold on to faith. And I don't know, I'm a little uneasy with some of that, but that has been an issue. So, so David had the idea that we really needed to do something, and so he knew me for my work and found me from Tony Jones as well, and the three of us started to work on this project together. So we did a planning grant stage where we did some research, and then we've been now started year 2 of the 3-year grant itself. So it's been really exciting so far, and I think it's something that we've been building momentum with. But we feel good that the momentum is building.
That's awesome. Tell maybe a little bit about what you've discovered as you've gone along in this grant process, and how you're sharing the things that you've discovered.
Yeah, well, I think our biggest challenge from the start is the foundation. I mean, any foundation or endowment doesn't want to just give money away to anyone or just throw it away. So they want to make sure that their investment is going to have an impact. And so there was a big question. I mean, they recognized the felt need of this, and that, man, that seems like that makes a lot of sense to try to help Protestant youth ministries have this faith and science conversation within their youth ministries, kind of broadly understood. But they weren't sure that anyone would really care, actually, and so that was our first hurdle. Like, would Joe or Jane, youth pastor, care about this topic? And I think at a certain level they would. I mean, we assume they would. But when it comes to everything else you have to do, like teach confirmation and maybe do a conversation on internet safety, on honoring your parents, on sexuality, and all the list of other things and other topics, the Bible, all that stuff would, a conversation on the natural sciences and faith, or on would string theory and faith for high school kids be on, would it be a felt need for youth workers? So we had to kind of show that that was a possibility. And really what we discovered, so we did a study just to see where the environment was at, where, try to get the lay of the land. And our sense was that youth pastors did see it was a felt need, but they weren't quite so sure that they could add it into all the other things that they were talking about. And so it was a challenge of how would we frame this conversation. And so we did talk with youth pastors, and we did interviews and focus groups with youth pastors, and we did interviews and focus groups with high school students, pretty much juniors and seniors. And we did discover that the youth pastors were like, I don't really want to deal with this. But the more they thought actually about how faith formation would happen and the challenges that some of the kind of scientific worldview draws, or I guess maybe the pressure it puts on young people's commitments, that they saw that that this was a significant piece. So it can't just be, I guess my point is, it can't just be about information. Like it can't be just, now we have to teach kids science alongside everything else. But when we see it as kind of a fundamental invitation to wrestle with young people's biggest questions about their lives and about the world, and about really the plausibility if God could exist at all, or how we would encounter a living God, they were quite engaged in that. So, and we've picked up momentum, I think, there too, to repeat that.
Cool. As a part of this project, are you developing resources or ways that people can talk to their young people? I know that, as a youth director myself, I spent a lot of time talking to kids about their sort of existential crisis with, this is what I am learning in school, and I don't know that I can reconcile what I've learned as far as the creation story and things like that, and how do I fit both of those things together, that many of them are still so concrete sequential that they can't figure out how both live alongside each other and work together. So is that a part of this? Like, are you coming up with?
Yeah, we're definitely creating resources, but I think one of the big things that we found in our own study, and it was really confusing actually for a while, because what we discovered when we did these focus groups with youth pastors, and one of our main kind of questions, or just ways we were trying to, again, take the temperature, was asking or getting a sense if youth pastors and youth directors thought there was a conflict between faith and science, like if there were this kind of big collision, and these were a zero sum, or at least there was some kind of big rivalry between these two things. And overwhelmingly across like very liberal to very conservative youth directors and youth pastors, that they really did see that there was a conflict between faith and science. But the funny thing is when we asked essentially their young people, when we asked 11th and 12th graders if they thought there was a conflict between faith and science, they overwhelmingly said no, that they did not see a conflict. They did recognize that other adults in their lives see a conflict, and that worries them, and they do have questions, but they didn't see why it had to be kind of this battle or this big rivalry. And that really it confused me. I interpreted it in a certain ways for a while, but it kind of confused me, and it's only been lately that I've started to be able to make sense of it, as I've been, one of my major objectives for the grant is to write a book, and I just have finished the first draft of the book, and trying to kind of interpret this was really helpful. And it seems a little obscure, but I think it gets right at your question. And I think a way to think about it is once you kind of untangle this knot of faith and science, that you can see there's kind of three different layers here. And I think we get confused across these layers, and to keep them separate is helpful. And one, I guess we could think about like faith as a social practice, that faith is a social practice. And when you think about these things, you have to kind of think about what are their aims, what are they about. And that faith's aim really is what we might say, like a soteriological aim or goal, and that the point is to encounter a personal God, to pray is to find some, however you define salvation in some way with this God. And that's why I think a lot of youth pastors are uneasy about thinking about having conversations about faith and science, because your number one kind of driving responsibility is around this kind of the soteriological aims of faith. Or you're really trying to help young people experience God, know God, partake in God's life. And you don't really, like have time to learn string theory. Like you're just trying to help young people learn to pray and read the Bible. But the interesting thing is that if you tease out the second layer, we could think of like scientific findings and theories. And it has an aim, and its main aim is really to try to describe the nature of the world, particularly the kind of empirical nature of the world. And it has both a technological goal and then what we might call an epistemological goal. I mean, the technological goal is to try to like help things work better, which is young people are quite into. Like wow, science has given me my iPhone. What has the church given me? It can sometimes be a cynical question they ask, but also I mean, science really is trying to tell us how the world functions the way that it does, and those are the kind of scientific findings and theories. And most young people, unlike most youth pastors, are spending their lives, at least part of their lives, kind of wrestling with scientific theories, trying to understand certain levels of physics or mathematics and certain theoretical perspectives. And there really is historically nothing contradictory about faith's commitment to a personal God and really any scientific theory or finding really necessarily. I mean, there might be tension between them, but they're not contradictory. But the third thing that we often get mixed up on is there's also science as a social practice. And when you think of science as a social practice, you can think of like people like Richard Dawkins and Daniel Dennett, and you can think of someone like even Neil deGrasse Tyson, who really are representatives of science as a social practice. Or you get this often when you talk to people, maybe kids will say this and they're susceptible to it, or adults will say it when they say, well, that's just science, man. Science just says that. That's just science. And so the social practice of science is really trying to make this argument really ultimately that the world, the universe, is an impersonal place. And it's those who are kind of the perpetuators of the social practice of science that see faith as fundamentally an enemy. So I guess my larger point, or long story longer, is that faith and scientific theories and findings, there isn't a direct conflict between them. There is a conflict between the social practice of faith and the social practice of science. And when you ask youth pastors, is there a conflict between faith and science, they often think at the level of social practice.
Sure.
So the social practice of faith and the social practice of science, there's a conflict there. You just read Richard Dawkins, and he's saying anyone who believes in God has a mental illness. Like that's a real conflict.
Yeah.
And as people are trying to help young people into the social practice of faith, that feels really threatening. But when you talk to young people themselves, when they hear science, they tend to think of theories. They tend to think of what they're learning in school, and they don't see necessarily a conflict there. So I think that helps us tease this out. And I guess the real big takeaway here is that if we can find a way in our youth ministries to actually put in dialogue the social practice of faith, or faith in dialogue with scientific theories and findings, then we in many ways break the hold, the rhetorical hold mainly, of the social practice of science. And that's why to me this becomes so important that we actually deal with some of the findings of science, because if we don't, then we kind of give the conversation away to the Neil deGrasse Tysons, the Richard Dawkins, that are really just trying to make a case that the world is a very impersonal place. And one of the big pushes, and I know I'm talking too much here, but one of the big pushes of the social practice of science is essentially to say anyone who needs the social practice of faith is a baby. That, and you can hear this often in the rhetoric, like, well, if you're the kind of person who needs a personal God in the universe, that's good, but I don't need that. Essentially, I've outgrown that.
Sure.
And that's the kind of perpetuation of that social practice of science, which is really deeply disingenuous because like the childlikeness is actually what's led those who've created scientific theories and big scientific ideas to have their breakthroughs. Like Einstein says, what made me the genius supposedly everyone in the world thinks I am, which he was, is that I refused to see the world any other way than as a child. But the rhetoric and the propaganda of the Neil deGrasse Tysons and the Richard Dawkins is really to say, well, if you want to be a baby and have to believe that there's some God up there who answers your prayers, go ahead, but I've outgrown that. And if we don't actually really get our hands dirty wrestling with the theories of the scientific, then we allow the social practice of science to kind of perpetuate and kind of, I don't know, hold the day in what it means for faith to be in conversation with our larger natural world. That was a mouthful. Sorry.
No, that's
Does that make
great.
any sense?
Yeah. Um, I'm sort of wondering from the listening audience, this is just as we continue to talk, I'm hoping this will come in and foster some more conversation. But um, what sort of questions are you from the listening audience getting from your kids or congregation members or whomever that gets at this? Or what sort of questions do you have, or hang-ups or whatever? Um, I'm wondering about the theological conversation that happens um, in thinking about how you speak about this in your churches. Because on one hand, I agree that kids, just like with, um, race or class or any sort of diversity kinds of conversation, they so don't have any hang-ups. It's the adults who do. Um, but there is, like, I'm thinking specifically of, what I mentioned before is that I spend a lot of time talking to kids about this. But as you were talking, and your clarification of juniors and seniors, thinking about like the most questions I get about this are from kids who are confirmation age,
Uh-huh.
which they're younger than juniors and seniors, and developmentally, they're very different than adults and than even juniors and seniors. So again, this is sort of a rhetorical deal, but like, what a terrible age we pigeonhole these kids into making these statements of faith at such a ridiculously weird time in their development. So that's more of just a statement of my leaning, but I continue to be invested in it, so maybe that says more about me and my social practice. But I'm just wondering about what is it that the church can and does say? I mean, right now I feel like it's not much
Mm-hmm.
about these two practices or um, their relationship to one another.
Yeah.
Is that making any
Yeah,
sense?
well,
I sort of feel like.
yeah, it is, and I think one of the things that we think is important, and we'll see if this pans out and is important to others. But I do think, I mean, it's a hard thing, right? Because these three different things that I've just described are really kind of tied together. So
Mm-hmm.
even when you're deeply learning, like say physics, like there's nothing in say quantum physics. There's been a lot written in quantum physics, and there's nothing distinctly in quantum physics
Mm-hmm.
that actually says there couldn't be a personal God in the world.
Sure.
That there could be a personal God working. But there's also, to be a quantum physicist is to kind of take on a certain ethos of the social practice of science too, and it's really hard to get tenure, say, at Iowa State as a physicist if you keep on saying, well, everywhere I look, every particle, there's God is in it. You tend not to be rewarded for that. And so young people pick that up too. I mean, young people are really asking those questions. And what's interesting to us is when young people really struggle with those, and really what they tend to confront youth directors and youth workers with tends not to be like, so how is it possible that, certain forms of, how is it really possible that Big Bang cosmology could, so-and-so and so-and-so. They usually don't throw the theory at you. What they tend to throw at us is kind of historical realities. Like, well, isn't the church always been against science because the church is, locked up Galileo? Or, isn't Darwin's point to actually destroy faith? And so part of our objective, too, is to show young people that the history really is not there, and that the church, the Western Church, Catholicism as well as Protestantism, has been more of an endorser of scientific breakthroughs and scientific theory construction than has been than it has inhibited it in any way. Actually, I mean that Darwin studied for the ministry, before he ever did any of his scientific work, and Galileo was never put in jail. I mean, there's an often myth like the church jailed Galileo. It isn't true. He
Huh.
was put on house arrest and was asked to recant, but still throughout his whole life, he supported his daughter, who was a nun, and he supported the church, as did Darwin. So usually the social practice of science likes to use the history actually as a way to say, see, faith and science have always been against each other. But when you lay these stories out to young people, I think it really shows that actually, no, the church is maybe the greatest, when we look historically, the greatest supporter and proprietor of scientific theory construction than really any, for sure, than any secular government and or any a private institution. I mean, the church is incredibly supportive of this, and all the early people who had their breakthroughs were people who were deeply committed to faith and deeply committed to God. So we're trying to raise that too, and I think that tends to help young people, because the history has been used more, I think, for the social practice of science than actually getting us into kind of the theory construction.
Okay. I have a couple of questions coming in, and so I hope that this is okay, Kathleen and Deb. I'm going to put yours together and just sort of make a common question about, like, okay, if a kid asked you, Andy, how is it that, I learned this at school. Like, let's just say there is a kid who is having a hang-up with this, for argument's sake, okay? How do science and faith exist? Like, yeah, there's nothing that says they can't, but like I at school am being sort of pigeonholed into thinking either anti-evolution or anti, creation, however those might get fleshed out in conversation, that, you have to either believe that two things slammed together and made what exists today, or a God created in 7 24-hour days, which is not what we believe as Lutherans, but how do you have that conversation with a young person?
Yeah, I mean, there's huge, questions of just ministry in general, of how you have it, but I mean, so maybe let me put it this way, and I think it depends obviously on who the young person is and what your relationship with that young person is, and how long you've been wrestling with this question. And I think people who know my work, is part of the objective here is to wrestle and be in a relationship with each other and seek for God in the midst of that. But particularly when it comes to evolution, or just the Big Bang or things like that, it really is quite dependent on where you start and where you look. So for instance, I mean, I think there's this kind of sense, like with Darwin, that like I think even mainline kind of Christian people tend to assume like Darwin's point was to destroy Christian faith, or particularly it's come from certain conservative Protestantism, that like Darwin is the love child of Hannibal Lecter and Darth Vader or something. You know what I mean? Like that's what Darwin is about, which is just really completely untrue. Like if you want a picture, like a pop culture picture of who Darwin is, Darwin's much more like Lord Grantham from Downton Abbey than he's like from Darth Vader or something like that. He's like in a kind of I don't know what would be the word, just like a very British gentleman, kind of gentle kind of guy who had stomach pains his whole life. And the story of Darwin actually is that his whole family before him were medical doctors, and they were true English gentlemen, nobility, and he was supposed to go to Edinburgh University to be a doctor like his brother and his father and his great-grandfather, and he pretty much failed out, and he failed out because he couldn't stomach watching surgeries, basically. These are like mid-19th century surgeries. If you've seen Nick on Cinemax or whatever, this is like how gross that was. That was like that's like 1910 or something, and this is like 1850. So Darwin could not take the absolute pain of this, of watching particularly children have to go through these operations. He was just far too sensitive. So the way he dealt with it was actually to become super into Beatles,
Uh-huh.
like looking for beetles under rocks. So he would walk around Edinburgh and like this was huge in England at this time, like beetle hunting. So he became a major beetle
Like
hunter,
the
and
early
and
Pokemon Go.
yeah, it was basically like the 19th century version of Pokemon Go. That was totally what it was. Or like, I don't know, like being in Brooklyn and brewing your own beer or something. It became like this like kitschy little fad that everyone was beetle hunting. And part of it was because, the Industrial Revolution was really happening in London. If you went into London, you'd get soot on your shoulders from the trains. I mean, it was just like hard industrialization, so people got back to nature. And so Darwin went out looking at beetles, but his father was not going to fund a education where Darwin looked at beetles. So he decided to send him to Cambridge and for him to study divinity. So he was going to become a pastor so he could get a pastor's education and then get an old country church, and he could do his naturalist studies, and he suffered from stomach pains and stuff. So that was his whole point. And so he actually passed all his divinity degrees, but one of the things that made Darwin uneasy was this guy named William Paley, who, this is a theory you all probably know. He had his kind of famous, it was called the clockwork theory, which is that if you were walking in a park or walking in a forest and you found a clock and you picked it up, you would have to believe that there was someone who created that clock. And so just like that clock has to have a creator, that watch has to have a creator, so God, when you look at the natural world, you have to see a creator behind it. And Darwin didn't buy that, and really what the theory of natural selection does is it gives us the possibility that there is no one behind the clock, behind the world working it. But yet still Darwin had this incredible he had this incredible faith in the church, and only stopped going to the church when his own daughter, I can't remember how old she was, 8 years old, died, and that's when he couldn't come to the church. But Darwin always kind of wondered about this, but there was another guy named Asa Gray who was an American botanist from Harvard, and he was really into, he was a devoted Christian, and he really saw how evolution did not oppose the Christian message, and that actually it's central to the Christian message that out of death comes new life. And Darwin had a hard time seeing that, but didn't think his theories were kind of atheistic in any ways. But Asa Gray saw how even evolution could point to the depth of the Christian story. So it really does kind of depend on where you start and where you look. Sure. And if you look at just the reality of human beings and our human consciousness, it's like a lot of scientists will talk about the second Big Bang, the fact that we are these kind of beings who can think about thinking. And when you start to look at evolution from that perspective, it's not nearly as reductionistic or as intimidating as we might assume. So, I mean, I think part of the way we talk with young people is, I mean, I personally think that we have to just honor the fact that evolution scientifically has a lot going for it, but that evolution just simply can't in itself answer the question of human consciousness and the depth of our ability to think about thinking. In the same way that kind of Big Bang cosmology, while it can give us kind of physical theories on why the world is here, it still can't answer the question of why there's something instead of nothing. And I think the wrestling with those things at that level is really significant. So I don't think that we should become apologists against the scientific theories, but actually kind of, okay, so that's there. What does it actually mean to be a human being? And that may take some kind of reflection and some thinking on our part, but I think the more that we can actually engage in pointing towards the transcendent spiritual dynamics within the scientific theories themselves, the better off that we actually are. That was a long story, wasn't it, about Darwin and stuff like that.
Okay. I want to get to this before we're almost out of time. Scott has a great question, and you started to go down that road, so I want to loop back there. He said that he was recently asked a question, why do so many people turn their back so easily on God when a loved one dies, but not on science?
Yeah, I mean, that is a really interesting question because often most directly, I mean, if we kind of go from our scientific perspective, science is, I guess, more directly failed than faith. I think a big issue, and I try to deal with this in my book, is that we get kind of, I think there's a way we get tricked into the game. I mean, you think of like Theodicy, remember from seminary, or you've heard Theodicy before, essentially like why God lets bad things happen. And Theodicy is a really new cultural phenomenon, and for the most part, it doesn't really exist as an area of theology until after the 17th century. And I think one of the things that the scientific revolution does is it turns everything into a puzzle. It kind of, in some ways, it has the temptation, the scientific, and this is why I don't think the scientific can stand alone, that the scientific has a way, it's not innately constructed to deal with mystery. That's not what it's about. It's got essentially a blind spot towards mystery. And what science then essentially does, and especially when we let the social practice of science lead the way, it can actually say there's no mystery in the world. There's only, all there is are riddles that can be solved. There are just problems that can actually be solved. And once you start to believe that or open yourself up to it, and issues like suffering are taken as not as the mysteries of the human condition, not as deep questions about what it means to be human and why do we suffer, but it really becomes ultimately about solving some kind of problem. Mm-hmm. Often what the social practice of science will throw back on faith, like, well, if your God is really a good God, like there's a certain atheist who has this really strong comment where he actually says, I'm more moral than God. I'm more moral than God because I would never allow a 3-year-old to die, and God does. And, of course, what that is putting this whole kind of conception of who God is within these kind of riddle perspectives. So one of the ultimate problems of the scientific that the social practice of science continues to perpetuate and really be an apologist for is that there are no mysteries in the world. There are only solvable riddles. And once we go to that, I guess when someone dies, we can say to science, well, science failed now, but they're working on the riddle of cancer, and they'll eventually solve it. But, you know, there's been all this bubbling up, especially these kind of memoirs that have bubbled up, like the book When Breath Turns the Air. I don't know if you've seen that New York Times bestseller, but it's about a doctor who's actually dying, and he talks about, like, the medical industry and that the overly scientific, technological actually lose our humanity in it. There's something much deeper about being with patients as they die. There's a mystery of their very humanity and their very life. And so I think part of us being in dialogue with faith and science is also to say, like, science has its limits. And it can't tell us about certain forms of mystery. And we should resist those forms of mystery. And I guess one of the ways to have this dialogue with our young people is to continue to take them back to things like art and back to the depth of their own kind of mystical and mysterious experiences, to not allow those to kind of be smothered by the propaganda of the social practice of science, or just the good but sometimes kind of bombastic work of the scientific. The scientific shouldn't be held or disparaged because it's just trying to say what empirically is. But the truth of the matter is that it can't say all of what reality is. And in some ways, faith can't either. Faith can't tell us necessarily how microprocessors work in and of itself. The Bible cannot even really tell us how the natural world necessarily got here, but it can deeply tell us about what it means to be human and what and the perplexities of our humanity and the beauty of it, and how this God seeks to encounter us in a certain way. And I think raising those things up and looking for overlaps while having distinctions between faith and its social practice and the scientific is really important. But I don't know, it's just a really insightful question that faith gets blamed. And part of the reasons faith gets blamed is that faith does give meaning to suffering. The scientific has no, in evolution particularly, has no meaning in suffering. Suffering is just simply a utilitarian move to allow for adaptation of other species. And so it can give no meaning. Like, why aren't dinosaurs here anymore? It doesn't really care why they're not here. They're not. They're extinct. And then that allowed space. I mean, I guess the answer would be, well, the lizard age had to end so mammals could thrive. But it doesn't give us any real meaning on what does it actually mean that a whole species that was part of that roamed the earth is completely extinct. What does that actually say? You know, there's still mystery innately in that question. So
Interesting.
I don't know.
Fascinating. Thank you so much for being with us. Is there a place I can point people to, the resources that may be developed along the way, or other ways to loop into this conversation?
Yeah, for sure. You can go to our website, which is, I should know this off the top of my head, but it's just scienceym.org. You can check. We're going to be putting up resources there, and we've done some interesting things. Like, we just got done doing a pilgrimage to Italy with 10 high school kids, and we walked kind of the steps of Galileo went from Rome to Florence, and then ended at the particle accelerator in CERN. And we're starting to put up videos from that, and how that impacted their kind of perspective of that history that I talked about, and how that history kind of seeing the full breadth of the history opens them up to see how faith really that faith was the major kind of proprietor of the scientific. So there's a bunch of stuff there. There's going to be some other videos. People can go to that. I know the ELCA has some great resources that they can use too for talking about science and faith with young people in their church. So there's places to go, but people can definitely check out our scienceym.org website to check it out. So
awesome.
And I'm always available, especially as in the next year or so, to talk about these issues at churches and conferences and things like that, so people know where they can find me as well. So
very good.
There you go.
Thanks again for taking time. I know you're busy speaking at another conference, so thanks for letting us jump in the middle of that. We're glad to have you here today. Just a couple of things as we wrap up. A reminder that registration is open for the 2017 extravaganza. It's earlier this year, January 19th to the 23rd, and it will be held in the wonderful city of Louisville, Kentucky. So for more information, you can check out elcaymnet.org/ext17. A reminder that if you like what you heard today, Andy's been with us a couple of other times, but we have an archive of over 50 titles now, so varied and many topics. So check those out, also found at elcaymnet.org. And next month, we're going to have Eric Barretto here with us talking about, or having a conversation about election season, thinking about how we talk about faith and politics with one another in the midst of the upcoming election. So you'll want to check that one out, October 18th. Thanks for being with us today. We're so glad to have been together. We hope you have an awesome day.